glad to have you with us today as we celebrate mothers, right? And spend some time together here. I know for the most part, moms, you worry about kids. And it's not just moms, like all parents, we worry about our kids. And there's certain things we worry about, like what if they make decisions I don't like, right? What if they make decisions I don't agree with? What if they make decisions that bring like hard times into their lives? How will they respond when the detours take place within their life? And what if things happen in their life, decisions they make or just actions that take place, and they end up walking away from God? I mean, we have as parents these incredible worries about our children. But I think the one thing that we hold on to more than anything else as parents is this word hope. That even in the tough times, the dark times of life, even the decisions that our kids may make, there's this hope that we have for their present and this hope that we have for their future. That's why today we start this brand new series, the one about Ruth. If any of you are big sitcom fans of the Friends show, you may understand the connection there. I just learned about this past week. So anyway, if you're a Friends fan, maybe that connects with you. But this story we're going to look at over these next 5 weeks is not a sitcom, all right? It's a great story. It's a strange story. There's a lot of life-altering decisions that we find in this story. There's a lot of loss in the story. We're going to talk about that this morning. But in the midst of everything that happens in the story of Ruth, there is this incredible, incredible hope that comes through God. And so we're just going to get right into it. Today we're going to walk through Ruth chapter 1. If you got a Bible, you can turn there. If not, it's going to be on the screen, or you can go to our notes page there on our app. Ruth chapter 1, starting with verse 1, it says, "In the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a severe famine came upon the land." You know, great books start with a great opening line, don't they? Kind of get you engaged with what's happening in the story. And we get this already. And this first line really kind of sets the mood for what we're going to look at in the rest of this chapter. Historically, the events in Ruth take place about 1000 BC. Sometimes religious historians will ask the question, like, why is Ruth in the Bible? And honestly, it's kind of a simple answer. Ruth is the great-grandmother of King David. And so Ruth is pointing to King David and this lineage that is there. But for us as Christians, we know that King David then points us to Jesus. And we'll talk about that as we go throughout this series. Now, at the time of Ruth, Israel doesn't have a king. They're led by these judges, from Joshua after Moses all the way till we get to the first king is anointed, King Saul. We have these judges. They're not politicians. They're not policymakers. They're not strategic thinkers. They're not thinking about the future. They're not great when it comes to taking care of the masses. These people are actually military leaders. And so some need would arise, some crisis would come about, and these leaders would rise up. They would lead Israel into these battles, into these fights, and bring about peace for Israel. Which is probably why we have a problem with this famine. Because again, these judges, they're not thinking about the future, right? They're not thinking, well, if a famine comes, how are we going to take care of all these people? They're just thinking about that one moment when they've got to lead this group of people to fight. And so this famine comes, and it causes all kinds of chaos there in Israel. Now, this is an agricultural society, so a famine would have been disaster for the Israelites. These judges, they're not going to be able to fight their way out of a famine. They're not going to be able to do what they would normally do when a famine hits. And because they didn't know how to really plan for something like this, it's also thought that Israel is in an economic crisis, like their economy is absolutely collapsing. In the midst of this, we meet this Hebrew family. Look at verse 1, or the rest of verse 1 through verse 2. "So a man from Bethlehem in Judah left his home and went to live in the country of Moab, taking his wife and 2 sons with him. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife was Naomi. Their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in the land of Judah. And when they reached Moab, they settled there." So within this mess, this chaos, we meet a family. You got a mom, you got a dad, you've got these two kids. And here's dad who's asked a pretty strategic question, like, what are we going to do? There's no food here. There's this famine. We've heard that there's food in Moab. And so he decides, well, let's just leave here and let's leave our family. Let's leave our friends. Let's leave this community and let's head to Moab where there is food. Now, the problem with this is the Moabites, they're not Israelites. They're not Hebrews. In Israel's eyes, this was a godless group of people. They were corrupt. They were the enemy many times. You would find that the Israelites and Moabites, if you know a little bit of your Bible history, would battle each other. But there's food there in Moab. And so Elimelech decides to take his family there. Kind of begs us to ask a question right here. What are some things that drive your decisions in life? And we can put a pretty big, long list of those decisions that drive us, right? Paying the bills, looking towards retirement, providing for our family, buying a bigger home, buying a home, purchasing a new car. For many of us, our circumstances that are around us, they really drive the decisions we make. And yet sometimes we make these decisions pretty hastily. In fact, if you read up on the story here and what Elimelech does with his family, many scholars think he does this pretty quickly. That he doesn't take time to find some advice from other people, ask for advice, that he doesn't spend time asking God, like, hey, God, what do you think's best? He just decides one day, like, hey, we've got to leave. We're going to leave everything that we know, our family, our friends, this community, and we're going to leave and we're going to head off to Moab because we need to take care of ourselves. The interesting piece to this, and we're going to find this throughout this whole book, Elimelech's name means God is king. This is this moment where it feels like Elimelech is saying, God's not actually king to me. It's like, I'm king. I'm going to make this decision. I'm going to do what I think is best for us and what's best for me. So I'm going to take my family. I'm going to leave this place that we know, and we're going to go as quickly as we can to Moab so that we can make sure we have food. Go back to that question, what are some things that drive your decisions in life? Maybe sometimes we like to say, hey, God is king, and yet our actions and the decisions we make in life really are different. They're more like Elimelech, and we're really saying, in the end, I am king. But here's the thing with decisions. We never know what they may bring our way. Look at verse 3. Then Elimelech died, and Naomi was left with her two sons. The two sons married Moabite women. One married a woman named Orpah, and the other a woman named Ruth. But about 10 years later, both Mahlon and Chilion died. This left Naomi alone without her two sons or her husband. This translation is probably a little bit misleading. They think that the total time they actually spent in Moab was 10 years. But as we can see here, these were really 10 tough years for this particular family. As the way it reads, it seems like they get there, and not too long after they get there, Elimelech actually dies. And so here's the husband who is gone. Here's a dad who is gone too. And then a little bit later on, these two sons die. Probably a little foreshadowing that we should have known about. The boys' names are Mahlon and Chilion. Those names mean sick and dying. It's kind of like, hey, let me introduce you to my boys, meningitis and tuberculosis. Why don't you give them a hug, right? Yeah, they didn't have, this should have been something they would have known pretty early on. They also think that when you look at the story here, that these two sons married Orpah and Ruth later on in those 10 years because there's no talk about there being children or them being childless, which would have been pretty important to this kind of story. And so we kind of look at this, and in 10 years, a lot has happened in this family's life. Elimelech moves them to get away from this famine to this new place, and then he dies, and then these two boys die, and she's left, Naomi's left with these two daughters, Orpah and Ruth, and they're not even Israelites. They're from this place called Moab. And so here is Naomi, who has no husband to care for her, and this is a pretty big deal in those days. She had no sons now to take care of her. And so she's left with these two Moabite women. And they don't share, at least she doesn't think so, the same faith background. These are pretty hard days for Naomi. But I'm guessing for some of us in this space, we've been in that place ourselves, that we've experienced loss. Maybe a mom, a dad, a husband, a wife, a child, a marriage, a job, a home. And sometimes it feels like that one loss happens and we kind of think, well, maybe that's it. And yet there's another hit that comes. And then another hit that comes, and another hit that comes. And we just kind of step back and we think to ourselves, why is this going on? Why won't this stop? And so these can be some pretty dark days in our lives. I love the way Shakespeare writes it in Hamlet. King Claudius says, when sorrows come, they come not single spies, but in battalions. Sometimes that's what it feels like, right, in life. Like something bad happens, and it just seems like it just keeps adding on and on and on. We start to ask questions like, is this bad luck? Is it just happenstance? Is this life? Or sometimes we ask, is this God? Verse 6. Then Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had blessed his people in Judah by giving them good crops again. So Naomi and her daughters-in-law got ready to leave Moab to return to her homeland. With her two daughters-in-law, she set out from the place where she had been living, and they took the road that would lead them back to Judah. So there's good news. She gets news back that there's some good things happening there in Judah, in Bethlehem, where she's from, that God's been blessing them, that there is now food there, there's harvest that is coming in. And she's like, I'm tired of this place. Like, I don't want to be here anymore. There's been nothing but pain. And so she packs up, grabs her daughter-in-laws, and they head back home. Verse 8. But on the way, Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, go back to your mother's homes, and may the Lord reward you for your kindness to your husbands and to me. May the Lord bless you with the security of another marriage. And she kissed them goodbye, and they all broke down and wept. No, they said, we want to go with you to your people. Here they are, they're traveling back to Naomi's home, and she just kind of has this change of heart. She's like, I was ripped away from my family. I was ripped away from my friends. I was ripped away from my community, and there's no need for you to experience this, so I'm going to let you go. Why don't you go back to your home? It's actually a pretty powerful moment, a very loving moment. This is a gift that Naomi is giving to these two ladies. But they say no. And Naomi, she kind of snaps. Verse 11. But Naomi replied, why should you go on with me? Can I still give birth to other sons who could grow up to be your husbands? No, my daughters, return to your parents' homes, for I am too old to marry again. And even if it were possible and I were to get married tonight and bear sons, then what? Would you wait for them to grow up and refuse to marry someone else? No, of course not, my daughters. Things are far more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord himself has raised his fist against me. You ever been around a perpetual pessimist? Like you'll say, hey, the sun is shining. The birds are chirping. Man, there's not a cloud in the sky. I mean, it's just a beautiful, amazing day. And then the pessimist jumps in and says, oh, it's too bright out here. The birds are too loud. Look, there's a cloud. I see it's way over there. And you just kind of want to tell that person, hey, we want you to turn that frown upside down. On our staff, we call that person Joel. Okay, Joel is seems to be our pessimist. Naomi's bitter. She's very bitter. She's like, I'm going home, but nothing good is going to happen to me when I get there. Hey, ladies, I don't have any more sons for you to marry. I'm old. Nobody's going to want to marry me when I show up there. My life is terrible. God hates me. But you go home and you enjoy your family, because I'm going to be alone and I'm going to be angry at God. It's like she sees God working against her now. That all of this is God's fault. That God, you made this happen. God, or maybe even, God, you didn't do anything. There's sort of three views of God when it comes to how we see God at work. I'm going to share two of those with you right now, because I think we see those so far in this story. The first view is that God has nothing to do with anything. Now, some say, God doesn't exist, that everything's just kind of happenstance, it's all kind of luck. But there's other people say, well, God does exist, but God doesn't care anymore. Like, God created everything, God washed his hands, now God's just done. Hey, it's a free-for-all. You do whatever you want to do, whenever you want to do it. This is all up to you. That God isn't involved in our daily lives at all. That God has nothing to do with anything. Second view that many people have of God is that God is involved in everything. That God controls everything, that God is orchestrating everything, that everything that is happening in your life, like God's this kid playing with a toy set and just moving these pieces all around. So the person that you date, the person that you marry, the job that you have, the house that you live in, the clothes that you wear, the food that you eat, that God is intricately involved in every single aspect of your life, that God is involved in everything. And so there's this view that God is nothing, or this view that God is everything. And we really do see this kind of play out in the story with Naomi and Ruth. At the beginning, it's like God's not doing anything, right? There's this famine there, and they're asking the question, where is God? God, why aren't you working in this? God, why aren't you giving food to your chosen people? You're not helping. And so there's this image that God, or this idea that God's not doing anything. And yet here we have Naomi, 10 years later, she's going back home. Should be a happy time. And yet what do we see her saying? Hey, God, look at the mess you made in my life. God, you've orchestrated this. God, you've made all of these terrible things happen in my life. And it creates this anger that she has, creates this incredible bitterness that she has towards God. And that bitterness doesn't go away. We're going to get to that in a second. But how does Ruth respond to this bitterness that she hears? Look at verse 14. And again they wept together, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. But Ruth clung tightly to Naomi. Look, Naomi said to her, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. You should do the same. But Ruth replied, don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us. There's a couple things that we can notice here in these words from Ruth. The first one is that Ruth clings to Naomi. The actual word that's used here for clings is the word cleaves. You might be like, I think I've heard that before. It actually goes back to Genesis when we read why a man leaves his father and mother and cleaves to his wife. It's the exact same word. So what that's telling us is it gives us this incredible image of this love that Ruth has for Naomi. Now, she's got every right to leave, right? She could leave. She could go do whatever she wants. Naomi has given her that freedom to do that, but that's not what Ruth does. Ruth says, hey, I'm with you no matter what. And so she clings to Naomi. But Ruth also clings to Naomi's God. Your God will be my God. Here's Naomi, who's a Hebrew, right? They're monotheistic, believe in this one God. Ruth comes out of this culture that is polytheistic, that believes in many gods, kind of do whatever you want to do. But as we see this part of the story right here, it really seems like the faith that Ruth has is actually much stronger than the faith Naomi has. And even in those moments where Ruth is sitting there and she's watching Naomi, and the way she handles this tragedy and this pain and this loss, and she sees this bitterness that Naomi has, even in all of that, there's something in Naomi at some point in time that influenced Ruth in such a way that she said, hey, I'm going to cling to your God. You ever think about the influence your life has on others? It's Mother's Day, and you kind of think about mothers, think about parents. Many of us, when we're younger, we say, hey, I'm never going to be like my parents, right? And oftentimes we say that pretty defiantly, like, I'm never going to be like them, I'm not going to talk like them, act like them, do things like they do. And what happens as you get older? You start to notice you're like your parents. You start to say phrases your parents say. You're like, oh my gosh, that was what my dad or my mom used to say. There's certain mannerisms or tics or even actions that you take, like, oh my goodness, that's what my parents used to do. You're eating dinner at 4:30 p.m. because that's what your parents did, right? So like you begin to look like and act like your parents because that influence, I mean, it seeps into your DNA, and oftentimes we become very much like our parents, even though we try so hard not to be like them at all. But let's think about this spiritually. I'm going to speak specifically to the parents for a moment. Parents, you ever think about how your faith life influences your children's faith life? Over the course of my 26 years in ministry, I've had many times where people have come up to me and said, hey, Chad, I don't understand. Like, my kid doesn't want to go to church. My kid doesn't want to follow Jesus. I mean, what's going on? And it almost comes across as they're blaming the church for this. And what I want to say about 90% of the time, knowing these parents, is maybe you need to go look in the mirror. Maybe the issue is not the church. Maybe the issue is you. Maybe if you were to look at your life and your faith walk and who you are, hey, who you are influences your children, and your children are just following in your footsteps. Like parents, we don't think about that. Our spiritual life and how we handle things and how we go through life, man, it influences the spiritual life of our kids. But let's even go beyond that. Let's just think about life in general. How does my expression of faith influence others and their faith? I think at some point in time, based on what we see here with Ruth and Naomi, that Naomi's faith was strong, and Ruth got to see that, and that influenced Ruth in her expression of that faith to Naomi on that particular day. I believe we get to see that Naomi gets a glimpse of that. If we look at verse 18. When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said nothing more. Who we are today might influence the life of someone else for Jesus later. Here at The Journey, we talk about our ones. We talk about people who are far from God. We even on staff, we talk about people who have PTSD from church, right? You've had some bad experiences, and maybe your ones are those people, and you know who they are, and you want to see them follow Jesus, and you've been praying for them. Maybe you've even invited them to church. You want them to encounter Jesus and experience community and engage in the mission that we are a part of, and yet you're like, why is it taking so long, right? Why can't that happen today? Well, sometimes the influence that we have on other people, it's not something that happens immediately. It's something that happens over time. And so that influence might not be today or tomorrow or next week or next year. It might be a decade down the road. And so we look at the story, and it seems like to me that there's something in Naomi that Ruth sees, something about her faith, that she's like, hey, I want that too. And maybe it's taken a few years to get to that place. Now, for others of you, you're here because of like the story of Ruth, right? Someone like Naomi influenced your life over time, and maybe you didn't make that decision to follow Jesus until way later on, but that influence that they had got you to the place where you are today. You're a follower of Christ because of that. You're in this space today because of the influence of their life over you. And so I think here in verse 18, there's like this moment where Naomi's like, oh, now I can see my influence on Ruth. Verse 19. So the two of them continued on their journey. When they came to Bethlehem, the entire town was excited by their arrival. Is it really Naomi? The women asked. So Naomi and Ruth, they show up, and for Naomi, this is coming back to Bethlehem. She gets to Bethlehem. All these ladies see her. They run out. Now remember, they didn't have the post office to send mail saying, hey, we're coming home. Didn't have email or text messages to send a note out. Couldn't do a TikTok video or an Instagram reel. They couldn't let people know. They just kind of showed up. And so they show up, and these ladies are like, it's Naomi. Like, we missed you. It's so good to see you. They're excited to see Naomi. But someone else is with Naomi, and it's not Ruth. It's actually bitter Naomi. Verse 20. Don't call me Naomi, she responded. Instead, call me Mara, for the Almighty has made life very bitter for me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me home empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has caused me to suffer, and the Almighty has sent such tragedy upon me? Here you are. You're back home 10 years later. You're with family now. You're with friends. You're with the community. They're seeing you there, and they run to you with these open arms. They're excited to see you, to spend time with you, and yet you're still bitter, blaming God for everything you've experienced in your life. Let's go back to names. Remember I told you that there's a lot of names in here, and they mean something. Naomi means sweet and pleasant. Mara means bitter. So here's Naomi said, hey, I just want you to know I'm not sweet and pleasant anymore, right? I'm an angry, bitter person, so call me Mara. Because this is how she feels towards God. I love this quote from Mark Twain. He said, God is the most popular scapegoat for our sins. You could also say God is the most popular scapegoat when life doesn't go as we planned. Or God is the most popular scapegoat when life doesn't go like we want. Or God is the most popular scapegoat when God feels too involved. Or God is the most popular scapegoat when God doesn't feel involved at all. Like we could continue on here, right? That it's very easy for us when things don't go the way we plan, things don't go the way that we hope, that we can say, hey, God, you weren't involved, or God, you were very involved, and God, look at my life. You've made it a mess. You haven't helped me at all. And we're angry, and we can be bitter. And again, if we go back and look at the story, we kind of see those first two views I talked about. God has nothing to do with anything. In this story, it's possible that God didn't care about the famine. God didn't care about Israel. God didn't care about Naomi's family. God doesn't care about Ruth. That God just did whatever God did at the beginning, and then God sat on the beach and is drinking that virgin margarita, just kind of enjoying the sun rays, right? There's this idea some people have that God doesn't want anything to do with us. But there's also that view that God is involved in everything. It's possible God brought that famine into Israel. It's possible God led Naomi and Elimelech and their family to Moab. It's possible that God made those sons marry these two Moabite women. It's possible that God killed Elimelech. It's possible that God killed Mahlon and Chilion. But then I would say, like, hey, God is just playing with toys, moving people around however God wants to do it, that God is involved in everything. But that's why I want to share this third view of God, that God has something to do with everything, but not in the same way. What do I mean? Look at verse 22. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by her daughter-in-law Ruth, the young Moabite woman. They arrived in Bethlehem in late spring at the beginning of the barley harvest. Let's go back to the very first verse in Ruth. Remember that one? In the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a severe famine came across the land. Naomi leaves, and she leaves with everything, right? She leaves with her husband. She leaves with her sons. She leaves with her life. She leaves with all her stuff. Here she is. She comes back to home. She comes back to Bethlehem, and she has none of that. She doesn't have a husband. She doesn't have her sons. She doesn't have her life. She doesn't have her stuff other than Ruth, who's with her. But Ruth isn't like her, right? They're coming from different faith backgrounds, different nationalities. So here's Naomi, feels alone. She's angry. She's bitter at God. And we read that. She says, the Almighty has sent such tragedy upon me. But look how Ruth chapter 1 ends. Arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest. I guess the Harleys could have shown up too, but barley harvest was beginning. Ruth 1 begins, these are dark days ahead. These are tough times. There's no hope. Ruth 1 ends saying, hey, no, hold up a second. That even in the darkest moments of life, even in the tough times of life, there is hope. That God has something to do with everything, but maybe not in the same way. That maybe there's some things God causes to happen. Maybe there's some things that God permits to happen in our lives. And we can see that in Naomi's life, right? But we can see it in our own lives. That we can look around and say, hey, God doesn't care. God doesn't intervene. What is God doing? Or we can say, hey, God's doing all this, and this is why I'm in this place in my life right now. It's so easy for us to say that. Or we can say, hey, you know what? God is actually doing something, but maybe in ways that are a little bit different than what we're thinking. Maybe in ways that are a little bit different than what we might expect. We see that in this story. That even in these decisions that Naomi makes, even when those dark days come her way, God's been at work. Just not how she hoped or how she had wanted. I think part of that we see through Ruth. And Ruth's able to say, hey, I cling to you, Naomi. Hey, I cling to your God, Naomi. That God has been at work in there. But also, as we look at this first chapter, that begins with this famine and ends with this harvest. That there is still hope. That God has been at work. Which leaves us, I think, with this question to wrestle with. How do you view God in your everyday life? For you, is God absent? Is God not there? Is God not care? Or for you, is God working in every little piece of your life, moving you around like a toy piece? Or is God intricately involved in your life, connected with you, but giving you freedom to make those choices in your life, but in the same time, reminding you of hope? Because how we view God will lead us to understanding that hope is present, or it will lead us to this place of saying, I'm angry and bitter at God. I love this quote from Martin Luther, a theologian. He wrote this to Erasmus, who was another theologian and philosopher. He said, your thoughts about God are all too human. I think sometimes that's our thinking about God, right? Our views about God, that we look at God and we're like, hey, this is the way God should act. This is what God should do because that's what I would do. That's how I would act. And we turn God into this human, and God's not human. God is God. And so how we view God and how God interacts with our life is so important to understand. But I believe the power from God is that even in the darkest days of our life, even in the hard times and the tough times, we realize there's this thing called hope. Every week before we get up here on a Sunday morning during the week, we send our messages out to a few people, just kind of get some feedback and, what's good, what stinks, what would you add, what would we take away? And so it kind of gives us a better perspective on what we say up here on stage. So I sent this out this past week and got some feedback, and one of the people wrote back like, hey, you probably should end with maybe a personal story or something. So I was kind of thinking through that. I'm like, all right, what would be a story that kind of shows this in my life? And as I was kind of thinking about it, I was like, well, it's not really a story, it's stories. And I can spend a lot of time up here just going through all these stories. I just want to quickly just hit a few that exemplify that even in the darkest days, there's hope. I've shared before that our first child was stillborn to Kara and I, that our youngest son, Jake, for about 5-6 years had some pretty serious heart issues that we're finally able to fix. Our oldest, she's had some pretty scary health concerns over the past 9 months, and we've been doing a lot of care for her and our grandson in that time period. About 15 years ago, Kara and I planted a church down in North Carolina, and when we were going down there, we were promised money and finances and resources and people and coaching from this one church. And as soon as we got down there, they were like, hey, sorry, we're pulling all of that. We were kind of left to fend for ourselves. There was a couple times at another church we worked at where our pay was not that great at all, and we paid all of our bills, and we had no money to buy food for our kids. Over the past couple of years, I've told you, I've struggled with some mental health stuff. About a year and a half ago, I thought it was a heart attack. Ended up being a pretty bad panic attack, and just kind of working through that through counseling and medication and stuff. And again, I could keep going on and on and on here. I could tell you this last year for our family has been kind of crazy. But the one constant has been God. That even in the hardest times, the darkest times, and when I can tell you those hits just kept coming and coming and coming, where it had been really easy to get really angry and bitter at God, and I'm not going to lie, there's a little bit of that in there too. The focus always came back to God. And that's been the one thing that has helped me and Kara and our family continue to move forward every single day. I don't know what you're going through. Some of you I do, and I know you're having a tough time right now. You're in a dark place. You're struggling with some things in your life, physically, mentally, financially. I can tell you there's still hope. That it may feel like the famine has hit, but the barley harvest is coming. It's here through Jesus.